my name is Hannah Bub, and before I start this speech, I'd like to thank the committee for taking time to review these videos and go through them. I'd also like to say that this is a third opposition speech on the motion about technocrats, and it's going to be around 7 to 7.5 minutes to account for not taking POIs. And then to outline the three substantives anticipated on each side, for prop, we think the substantives are going to look like an argument about government responsibility and a social contract to make fact-based laws, and then what happens when you have fact-driven policy, and then finally on decreasing populism. And then in opposition, the substantives were the principle of democracy, having more effective policy, and then finally decreasing corruption. Side proposition loses this round when they make a few key mistakes that lead to people having less right to representation, less democracy in a field that needs to fairly represent people because their lives are at stake. It is because we always believe in representing these people fairly that we are opposing to you today. In this speech, just a few things. First, we're going to look at some notes on framing before giving the three key clash points of today's round. But now let's look at some framing mischaracterizations that proposition makes that ultimately lose them today's round. First of all, they try to tell you that technocrats are elected officials in their world. Think back to our first speech where we offer very clear warranting as to why this isn't true. Firstly, this round asks us to contrast between a democracy and a technocracy. Technocrats are defined as individuals who have more technical knowledge on a certain topic than public appeal and government. So we think that if technocrats were elected, this would make them politicians, and the comparison is null. But then, second, on proposition side, they concede that technocrats would still be appointed by people in government, meaning that although they're the sole decision makers on criminal justice policy, they have no accountability to the general population. Instead, opposition would prefer a world where technocrats can advise government officials, but they're never the sole actors making those decisions. So then let's look at our first key clash point, which is on who best upholds democracy. From the top of this debate, we told you how side proposition erodes democracy by allowing technocrats who are not elected officials decide criminal justice policy. This fundamentally disregards fair representation, which is a key pillar of democracy that's essential to ensuring people's best interest and their needs are actually communicated in government. But in proposition's world, we think technocrats make key decisions about criminal justice without actually representing people's needs, which is always going to be morally reprehensible. To our argument, they give you one main response. They tell you that if technocrats create good, data-driven policies, it doesn't matter if they were democratically elected because the outcome is positive. A few notes here. First of all, this argument is hung on the assumption that technocrats will create outcomes that are best for citizens. We don't think this happens, as per our second substantive, where we told you that technocrats are going to make less effective policy at the point where they only focus on data and not the nuances of government, but then this allows them to further marginalize minoritized groups that are often overrepresented by statistics and crime. But then, when decisions on criminal justice are made by a closed group of technocrats that aren't influenced by democratic principles, it limits grassroots movements and public advocacy groups because citizens see that they don't have a voice in government, but social movements are key to criminal justice, like when we see movements like the Innocence Project that works with the DNA to fairly represent and exonerate innocent people. Then, even if you do think that technocrats create better policy outcomes, you still vote for opposition because we're the only side that protects the principle of democracy, and the core of democracy is equal rights and power for every citizen, which always is valued first before anything practical, because it doesn't matter if a policy has a good outcome for you if your democratic rights were violated in order to get there. So now, let's move on to our second clash on who best prevents corruption. We told you from our substantive 3 that technocrats are much more susceptible to corruption because they don't have to worry about re-election. This also means things like lobbying and bribery are going to become more common, but technocrats are more likely to act in their own self-interest instead of that of citizens because they don't feel direct responsibility to citizens as they were not elected. Here, proposition gives you 2 key responses. First, they say that technocrats will be less corrupt because they're not incentivized to appeal to the public for election or companies for endorsement, and therefore they make decisions based on statistics instead. And then they say that if politicians use technocrats as advisors, it supercharges corruption because they maintain the illusion that they're backed by facts. There's a few reasons why what they give you here is simply false. First of all, remember that they have to defend to you why technocrats should be the sole deciders of criminal justice law. At the point where we can't even assume adequate checkback from other government officials because they have no say in the law, we don't think this is more like less corrupt policy. But then, even if we see corrupt officials on our side, they're always held in check by citizens and other officials. Then, while a complete technocracy has never been fully achieved, we see examples of technocrats exercising corruption, like in Brazil from 2016 to 2018, where the technocrats in government awarded high bonuses to executives in a time of economic crisis, and when the fuel policies that they decided on caused a nationwide trucker strike. We also saw in Italy from 2011 to 2013, they appointed technocrats to all places of cabinet who then had conflicts of interest where they were benefiting local corporations instead of actually trying to help citizens. We don't think that this is the epitome of having purity and not corruption. Then, you always prefer our side because it's much more probable that technocrats are going to be corrupt and act in their own interests instead of actually protecting the citizens, which is what this job was always supposed to do. So our last clash is on which side has the most effective policy for improving the criminal justice system. We gave you very clear warranting on why elected officials are always going to make better policy, but the core of the argument that proposition gives you is that technocrats act on statistics. These statistics that technocrats use are easily skewed, meaning that they don't always represent the best policy decisions. We saw this in the World Bank in 2021, where business statistics related to China were skewed and caused a scandal. But even if the manipulation of statistics doesn't happen on purpose, the statistics that technocrats use in relation to criminal justice often overrepresent minoritized communities, which leads to more biased policy at the point where they don't focus on the nuances and systemic nature of crime, but simply just numbers. The only additional warranting that Prop gives you here is that technocrats are less biased, and so they solve gridlock because they don't adhere to political parties. A few points on why this is simply untrue. First, in our world, we support the use of facts and statistics through advice given to actual elected officials. This means that opposition has the best of both worlds when laws are influenced by facts, but also the nuances of government. But also, politicians are more likely to use those statistics to benefit people that they represent. Secondly, on this argument about gridlock, we think that the existence of political parties is essential to fair representation, where decisions take time to come to fruition because politicians want to best represent the best possible outcomes for citizens, and at the point where the proposition denies you this representation, they admit to making policy worse because it isn't actually made to represent citizens. So then, to vote for the protection of democracy in a system that necessitates the fair representation of vulnerable individuals, you have to vote opposition.